By late autumn of 1950, the Korean War appeared to be entering a concluding phase. United Nations forces had reversed the initial North Korean offensive, executed the amphibious landing at Incheon, recaptured Seoul, and pushed northward across the 38th parallel into North Korean territory. The advance continued with minimal resistance through October, covering distances that exceeded operational planning assumptions. North Korean forces had been shattered as cohesive units, and intelligence assessments suggested organized resistance was collapsing. Strategic objectives shifted from containment to reunification of the peninsula under South Korean authority, requiring occupation of territory extending to the Chinese border along the Yalu River. This northern advance created logistical challenges that grew more severe with each mile gained. Supply lines stretched from ports at Pusan and Incheon through damaged or inadequate road networks into mountainous terrain where infrastructure was minimal. The distance from Pusan to the northern provinces exceeded 300 miles, and every ton of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment required for forward units had to traverse this distance by truck convoy over roads that deteriorated as autumn rains turned to winter weather. Railway lines existed, but had been damaged during earlier fighting and required extensive repair. Air transport could supplement ground convoys, but lacked capacity to sustain entire divisions operating at extended range. Communication systems similarly struggled with the expanded operational area. Radio networks designed for tactical coordination functioned adequately over short distances, but became unreliable when units dispersed across hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain. Relay stations were established but depended on functioning equipment, trained operators, and atmospheric conditions that varied unpredictably. Message traffic between forward units and higher headquarters often experienced delays measured in hours, and sometimes messages failed to transmit at all. Commanders made decisions based on information that was incomplete or outdated by the time it reached them, a situation accepted as unavoidable given the circumstances. Intelligence regarding enemy capabilities in the northern regions was limited and often contradictory. Aerial reconnaissance reported movement along roads and in valleys, but could not determine the composition or intentions of forces observed from altitude. Prisoner interrogations provided fragmentary information, suggesting Chinese forces had crossed the border into North Korea, but the scale and purpose of this movement remained unclear. Some reports indicated only volunteer units operating independently, while others suggested larger formations under centralized command. Higher headquarters assessed that Chinese intervention, if occurring, would be limited in scope and defensive in nature, intended to protect border areas rather than engage in offensive operations against United Nations forces. In this context, a regimental combat team received orders to advance northward and occupy positions along a river valley leading toward the border region. The regiment consisted of approximately 3,000 men organized into 3 infantry battalions supported by artillery, engineers, medical personnel, and headquarters elements. They were equipped with standard infantry weapons, vehicles for transport and supply, and communication equipment appropriate for operations at division level. The regiment had participated in earlier phases of the campaign and sustained moderate casualties, which had been replaced with new personnel who arrived during brief rest periods in rear areas. The advance began in early November. The regiment moved by truck convoy along a dirt road that wound through valleys and over mountain passes, progressing approximately 30 miles per day when conditions permitted. Villages along the route were largely abandoned, and civilian presence was minimal. The few inhabitants encountered appeared wary and provided little information when questioned. Signs of recent military activity were evident: abandoned equipment, defensive positions that had been prepared but not occupied, and fields showing damage from artillery or airstrikes. The absence of organized resistance during the initial phase reinforced assessments that North Korean forces had ceased effective operations in the area. After 3 days of movement, the regiment reached its designated objective area and began establishing defensive positions. The terrain consisted of ridgelines running east to west with a river flowing north through the valley floor. The road followed the river, providing the only practical route for vehicle traffic. Hills on either side rose steeply, covered in scrub vegetation and rocky outcroppings that limited visibility and made off-road movement difficult. Temperatures had dropped below freezing at night, and snow appeared on higher elevations. The regimental commander positioned his battalions to control the road and provide mutual support, with one battalion forward along the river, another in reserve centrally located, and the third securing the southern approach to prevent interdiction of the supply route. Resupply convoys arrived every 2 to 3 days, bringing ammunition, rations, fuel, and mail from rear areas. The convoys traveled without significant interference, though drivers reported occasional small arms fire from distant hillsides that caused no damage. Communication with division headquarters was maintained through scheduled radio contacts twice daily, supplemented by courier when radio transmission failed. Reports sent to higher headquarters described positions occupied, patrol activity, and absence of significant enemy contact. Division acknowledged these reports and provided updates on operations in other sectors, which indicated similar patterns of advance and consolidation without major resistance. Patrol activity during the first week revealed little. Small units moved out from the main positions to reconnoiter surrounding terrain and ensure no enemy forces were massing nearby. These patrols encountered empty villages, occasional evidence of recent occupation such as cold campfires or discarded equipment, but no actual contact with hostile forces. The lack of contact was noted but not considered alarming, as it aligned with the general assessment that organized enemy units had withdrawn northward or dissolved entirely. Some patrols reported observing movement on distant ridgelines, but the distances involved made identification impossible and engagement impractical. Weather conditions began deteriorating in the second week. Temperatures dropped further, and snow fell with increasing frequency. The river began developing ice along its edges, and vehicle movement became more difficult as mud froze into hard ruts. Soldiers experienced cold-related issues, including minor frostbite on extremities, reduced manual dexterity affecting weapons handling, and increased fuel consumption to keep vehicles operational. Winter clothing had been issued but was not uniformly distributed, and some men lacked adequate boots or gloves. Medical personnel treated cold injuries as they occurred but noted that prolonged exposure would lead to more serious cases requiring evacuation. On the 9th day of occupation, a patrol from the forward battalion reported contact with unidentified forces approximately 3 miles north of the regimental positions. The patrol had been moving along a ridgeline when they observed troops in significant numbers moving through a valley parallel to their route. The distance prevented accurate count, but the patrol leader estimated at least several hundred individuals moving in organized columns. The patrol attempted to maintain observation, but was detected and withdrew under fire, suffering one casualty before breaking contact. They returned to friendly lines and reported what they had seen. The regimental commander forwarded this information to division with a request for clarification regarding friendly forces in the area, as no other United Nations units were supposed to be operating that far north. Division responded after several hours indicating no friendly forces were present in the location described and requesting additional information. The regimental commander ordered increased patrol activity and heightened alert status but received no further guidance on how to respond to the reported contact. Over the following 2 days, additional patrols confirmed increased enemy presence in the surrounding area. Observation posts reported movement on multiple ridgelines during daylight hours, with forces appearing to maneuver into positions overlooking the regiment's locations. The numbers observed suggested company or battalion-sized elements, potentially more. Attempts to engage these forces with artillery were limited by ammunition availability and the difficulty of accurately targeting mobile forces in mountainous terrain. Air support was requested but not provided, with division explaining that weather conditions and competing demands from other sectors prevented allocation of aircraft. Communication with division became increasingly sporadic. Scheduled radio contacts sometimes failed to establish connection, and when contact was made, the transmission quality was poor. Messages sent by courier took longer to reach division headquarters and longer still to receive responses. The regimental commander reported his assessment that enemy forces were concentrating in his area and requested guidance on whether to continue holding positions or withdraw to more defensible terrain closer to supporting units. Division acknowledged the report and stated that higher headquarters was reviewing the situation. On the 12th day, the regiment experienced its first significant contact. Mortar and artillery fire began falling on the forward battalion's positions during early morning hours. The fire was more accurate than previous harassing fire had been, suggesting forward observers were directing it from nearby high ground. Casualties were moderate but included damage to vehicles and communication equipment. The forward battalion commander reported his positions under attack and requested reinforcement and fire support. The regimental commander committed his reserve battalion to reinforce the forward positions and called for division artillery support. Division artillery responded, but the range to the regiment's positions was at the maximum effective distance for the guns, reducing accuracy and limiting the weight of fire that could be delivered. The artillery fire provided some suppression, but enemy mortar fire continued intermittently throughout the day. No ground assault developed, and by evening the situation stabilized, with the regiment holding its positions but aware that enemy forces were capable of directing effective indirect fire onto their locations. The resupply convoy scheduled to arrive that day did not appear. Radio contact with the convoy was attempted but unsuccessful. Division informed the regimental commander that the convoy had been delayed due to unspecified problems along the route and would attempt to reach the regiment the following day. Fuel and ammunition stocks were reviewed and found adequate for several more days of operations at current expenditure rates. But rations were lower than desired, and medical supplies had been depleted, treating recent casualties. The following day brought no convoy and no significant change in the tactical situation. Enemy forces maintained pressure through sporadic mortar fire and probing attacks against outposts, but no major assault materialized. The regiment responded with defensive fire and maintained its positions. Communication with division remained difficult, and when contact was established, the information provided was increasingly vague. The regimental commander was told that operations across the entire front were being reevaluated and that he should continue holding pending further orders. Ammunition consumption was becoming a concern. The previous day's fighting had expended significant quantities of mortar and artillery rounds, and defensive fires to suppress enemy positions continued to draw down stocks. The regimental commander implemented conservation measures, directing that fire be employed only against clearly identified targets and that automatic weapons fire be limited to short bursts. These measures slowed the rate of consumption but did not address the underlying problem that resupply was not arriving. On the 14th day, reconnaissance elements reported that the road south had been cut. A patrol sent to investigate the convoy's delay found enemy forces occupying positions astride the road, approximately 10 miles south of the regimental area. The enemy had established a roadblock using destroyed vehicles and prepared defensive positions covering the approaches. The patrol engaged at long range and withdrew after determining the position was too strong to reduce with the forces available. The regimental commander reported this development to division and requested immediate action to clear the road and restore supply lines. Division's response took several hours and was not reassuring. Higher headquarters was aware of increased enemy activity throughout the northern sectors and was repositioning forces to address multiple threats. Clearing the road to the regiment was a priority, but no specific timeline could be provided for when relief would arrive. The regiment was instructed to maintain its positions and defend against enemy attacks while conserving supplies. The possibility of withdrawal was mentioned but not authorized, as abandoning positions would conflict with the overall operational plan. The regimental commander assembled his battalion commanders and staff to assess the situation. Ammunition stocks were sufficient for perhaps 3 more days of moderate combat. Fuel reserves allowed for vehicle operations, including a potential withdrawal, but would not support prolonged defensive operations requiring frequent repositioning. Rations were critically low, with less than 2 days of food remaining. Medical supplies had been exhausted except for basic items, and wounded personnel requiring evacuation were accumulating. The regiment had sustained approximately 150 casualties since arriving in the area, reducing effective strength by roughly 5%, but degrading combat capability more significantly due to loss of key personnel, including squad leaders and specialists. The decision was made to prepare for potential withdrawal while continuing to hold positions as ordered. Plans were developed identifying routes south that avoided the blocked road, using secondary trails and cross-country movement. These routes would be difficult, requiring abandonment of heavy equipment and vehicles, but were feasible for dismounted infantry. Wounded who could not walk would need to be carried, which would slow movement significantly. The plan assumed that enemy forces would attempt to interdict any withdrawal, requiring rear-guard actions and possibly significant fighting to break contact. Before these plans could be executed, the situation changed again. On the 15th day, large-scale attacks developed against all 3 battalions simultaneously. The attacks began before dawn with heavy mortar and artillery preparation that lasted over an hour. Enemy infantry then assaulted from multiple directions, advancing in groups that used terrain effectively and demonstrated tactical proficiency exceeding what had been encountered previously. The attacks were coordinated and sustained, indicating centralized command and adequate supplies to support extended combat operations. The forward battalion bore the initial weight of the assault. Enemy forces penetrated the perimeter in 2 locations, forcing hand-to-hand fighting before the penetrations were sealed by local counterattacks. Casualties mounted rapidly, and ammunition consumption accelerated as defensive fires attempted to break up follow-on waves. The battalion commander requested reinforcement, but the reserve battalion was simultaneously engaged, defending its own positions and could not provide support. The regimental commander committed his headquarters company to reinforce the forward battalion, leaving minimal personnel to maintain command and control functions. Fighting continued throughout the day without decisive result. The regiment held its positions, but only through maximum effort and expenditure of resources that could not be sustained. By evening, ammunition stocks for some weapon systems were exhausted, mortar crews had fired their last rounds, and machine gun belts were being rationed to ensure some capability remained for the next attack. Casualties had increased to over 300, representing 10% of the regiment's strength, with a disproportionate number among infantry riflemen who bore the brunt of close combat. That night, the regimental commander established radio contact with division and reported the situation without embellishment. He stated that his regiment could not withstand another attack of similar intensity, that supplies were exhausted, and that casualties required immediate evacuation. He requested permission to withdraw while the regiment retained sufficient combat power to fight its way out. Division responded that the request was being forwarded to higher headquarters and that a decision would be communicated as soon as possible. No decision arrived before dawn brought renewed attacks. The pattern repeated. Preparatory fires followed by coordinated infantry assaults against multiple positions. The regiment defended with diminished resources and growing desperation. Men fired their weapons until ammunition was gone, then used grenades, then fought with entrenching tools and rifle butts when enemy soldiers reached the positions. Some positions were overrun, and the perimeter contracted as survivors withdrew to secondary defensive lines. The regimental commander lost communication with one battalion when their radio was destroyed, and he had no clear picture of the situation across his entire sector. By midday, it became apparent that continuing to hold was impossible. The regimental commander made the decision to withdraw without waiting for authorization from higher headquarters. He issued orders for all units to break contact and move south using the planned withdrawal routes. The movement would begin immediately, with each battalion responsible for its own withdrawal and a designated link-up point 15 miles south where the regiment would attempt to reconsolidate. The withdrawal was chaotic but not panicked. Units broke contact in stages, with rear guards covering each phase while the main bodies moved back. Equipment that could not be carried was destroyed to prevent capture. Wounded were placed on improvised stretchers or assisted by walking wounded. The movement proceeded slowly through difficult terrain, with men exhausted from continuous fighting and weakened by lack of food and sleep. Enemy forces pursued, but cautiously, engaging with long-range fire rather than closing to assault the withdrawing columns. The first day of withdrawal covered approximately 8 miles. The regiment moved through the night, navigating by compass and using terrain features visible in moonlight. Contact between units was intermittent, and some elements became separated in the darkness. By dawn, the regimental commander had gathered approximately 2/3 of his strength at a temporary position, with the remainder still moving or out of contact. Enemy forces had not pressed the pursuit aggressively, possibly consolidating their own positions, or unwilling to risk casualties against a still capable force. Resupply remained impossible. The men subsisted on whatever rations they had carried and foraged what they could from abandoned positions and villages along the route. Water was obtained from streams, though ice formation made access difficult. Medical care for wounded was minimal, limited to bandaging and administration of morphine for pain. Several men died of wounds during the movement, their bodies carried as long as possible before being buried in hastily dug graves marked for later recovery. On the third day of withdrawal, forward elements made contact with friendly forces moving north to establish blocking positions. These forces were from a division that had been repositioned to address the deteriorating situation in the northern sectors. They were under orders to establish a defensive line and halt the enemy advance, creating space for withdrawing units to pass through and reconsolidate. The regimental combat team passed through these positions and continued south to a rear area where they could receive resupply, medical care, and rest. Casualty accounting after the withdrawal determined that 420 men had been killed, wounded, or were missing. Effective strength had been reduced by approximately 15% killed and another 15% wounded seriously enough to require evacuation and extended recovery. Equipment losses included most vehicles, all heavy weapons that could not be manhandled during the withdrawal, and significant quantities of individual equipment abandoned to reduce load during movement. The regiment would require weeks to reconstitute before returning to combat operations. After-action assessments identified multiple factors contributing to the regiment's situation. Intelligence failures regarding enemy strength and intentions had led to operational plans that placed units in exposed positions without adequate support. Communication limitations prevented timely coordination and decision-making. Logistical constraints meant that supply lines could not be maintained over the distances involved, leaving units vulnerable when roads were interdicted. Command decisions at higher levels, made with incomplete information and influenced by strategic assumptions that proved incorrect, had committed forces beyond the range where they could be effectively supported or reinforced. These lessons were documented and forwarded through channels, contributing to revisions in operational planning and execution for subsequent phases of the war. The recognition that Chinese forces had intervened in significant strength fundamentally altered strategic calculations and led to withdrawal of United Nations forces from advanced positions throughout North Korea. The war transitioned from an offensive aimed at reunification to a defensive effort to establish stable lines and negotiate from a position of strength rather than pursue military victory. For the men who had served in the regimental combat team, the experience of being cut off deep in North Korea without reinforcements became a defining event. Those who survived carried forward an understanding of how quickly situations could deteriorate when assumptions proved false and support failed to materialize. The physical injuries healed over time, though some men bore permanent disabilities from wounds or frostbite. The psychological impact was less easily resolved, as memories of fighting without adequate ammunition, withdrawing while carrying wounded comrades, and recognizing that help was not coming remained vivid for years afterward. The broader historical record incorporated this operation as one among many that occurred during the chaotic period when Chinese intervention transformed the Korean War from a nearly concluded campaign into a protracted conflict. Individual experiences of units like this regiment illustrated the human cost of strategic miscalculation and the resilience required to survive when operational plans collapsed. The war continued for 2.5 more years, eventually stabilizing along lines near where it had begun, with neither side achieving the decisive victory that had seemed possible in those autumn months of 1950.